Ladies and gentlemen, in a historic, trend-setting turn, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 innovates with the first cake in a superhero movie to foreshadow the supervillain. Foreshadowing cakes. It's gonna be the next big literary device. It's gonna be all the rage. Tell your friends. Ba, ba, ba. The following is an in-depth story analysis. If you haven't seen this film, you might want to before watching this review. As the franchise reboot becomes more commonplace, we're beginning to see the rise of a new phenomenon, the obligatory sequel. It happens when a character is more popular than the version a studio tried to sell last time, when continuing on a new path is safer than starting over again from scratch, but not so safe there's any telling if the numbers will work out the same way again, based simply on the popularity of the character that's being adapted. It's an incredibly awkward and uncomfortable place to be in, for the studio and the filmmakers, and also for the consumer. It's no fun to be stuck with a vision the vast majority of fans aren't enthusiastic for, but everybody involved is wedged between a rock and a hard place. If the movie makes enough money to warrant a sequel, even if it doesn't perform as well as the studio projected, it looks on paper like there's enough interest to keep going with the current version. And even if that new version isn't what the fans want, or even if they hated what was done first time out, a lot of them will still give the franchise another chance because it's been a couple years and they love their favorite character and they're hoping, maybe against hope, that they can be won over this time. But just because a superhero movie makes money doesn't mean the lovers of the source material loved what was made. It only means they cared enough to go see what was done with it. A lot of diehards for any particular brand today will begrudgingly hand over their hard-earned cash even if they think they'll dislike it, either because they feel obligated or out of morbid curiosity. Not to mention that we've made a culture out of hating and making fun of things. There are a number of franchises that rely on that sense of obligation and curiosity whenever they're rebooted to perform, but that success generally isn't sustainable over the long term if audiences don't fall in love with the new version. The literal billion-dollar question is this: if the viewing public is polarized, or sometimes worse, indifferent toward the first movie, what should you deliver the second time around? Do you ignore all criticism and continue forward best you can, as if you've gotten no feedback on the first film at all? Or do you take that feedback to heart? And what's more important, the consistency and integrity of the ongoing narrative, or giving fans exactly what they want? The DC Extended Universe began as an example of a studio ignoring the haters and barreling forward, full speed ahead, continuing with a self-serious and tonally dark version of Superman, though a more stylized version of the world we were introduced to before, and introducing Batman as added brand security to entice even people who didn't like that movie to see its sequel. Bones were thrown to Man of Steel's detractors. The collateral damage issues were addressed in a couple different ways, but Batman v Superman wasn't an apology for Man of Steel, nor was it a sharp turn in a new direction. It relied on the love of its characters and the history-making event of Batman and Superman duking it out on the big screen for the first time. It relied more in its advertising on the idea of that fantasy grudge match fans never thought they'd see than it did on interest in more stories about this new version of Superman. The 2014 Ninja Turtles film, on the other hand, started out in a place of trying to placate fans of the existing material, using an unhappy Turtles fan base as a sounding board throughout production, and changing anything fans found out about to match what they were used to, rather than taking a chance on a radical new interpretation. That was another film that was successful enough at the box office to warrant a sequel, but one that it would be hard to argue had a lot of eager fans. Paramount was stuck there with trying to continue a franchise built on a foundation of it's just okay. The sequel delivered much the same, generic, uninspired Turtles fare that attempted to tickle the nostalgia bone like Abrams' 2009 Star Trek film, but with a little panache or anything new to bring to the table. It did the opposite of Batman v Superman. It attempted to give the audience exactly what it thought we wanted, but there wasn't enough interest from the mediocre response of that first movie, and it didn't have a Batman to make it an obligatory cultural event. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is one of the most overblown mixed bags I've ever reviewed, because it tries to do both, and then some. Like Batman v Superman, it tries to move forward with its tone and some semblance of its initial premise. But like Ninja Turtles, it's overly aware that it didn't start as something a lot of fans were enthusiastic about, and it addresses all those things in surface, obvious, and intrusive ways. Throughout the commentary with some of the writers and producers on the DVD, they use the phrase, "we aim to please." And it shows. It tries so hard to make everybody on the planet happy. People who loved Amazing, people who hated Amazing, people who wish the Raimi movies were still being made, people who don't even like Spider-Man, actual rhinos, Muppet fans, people who like but don't know anything about classical music, firemen, elevator operators, dubstep listeners, everyone. It's ironic that this is the movie with this version of Electro, because, like this Max Dillon, it's afraid no one's going to pay attention to it. It's in denial about its own lack of significance, and it is desperate for everyone to love it. By the end, I'm practically expecting the movie itself to electrocute anyone in the audience that isn't holding up a perfect 10 sign. I'm expecting the DVD box to get up off my desk while I'm recording this and get angry that I forgot its birthday. There's stuff to like here, certainly, but a lot of what works are disparate elements, specific details, ideas that are interesting alone but don't gel well with the rest of the piece. And it's so overstuffed and overly long, I'm drained by the time I get to the end. Most of its characters are really sympathetic and engaging. At some point during the film. At other times, those same characters have muddled motives and seem to be just doing whatever the film needs them to in order to progress us to the next plot point. There are actions and consequences that drive the narrative, but there are other things that sometimes steal the driver's seat, like faulty premises and plot conveniences. The last film had a really solid internal conflict for Peter and a great love story, but a pretty shoddy and inappropriately large-scale villain plot. This movie continues that great interpersonal stuff with Peter and Gwen, except when it's not great. And it's much better at the comic book action stuff, except when it's not. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 doesn't have a concrete vision for its protagonist or its story. It's sort of like Spaceballs, throwing a zillion things at the wall and hoping something sticks. Except it's begging me to take it seriously, no matter how preposterous it gets. Even with silly one-liners like, "It's my birthday, time for me to light the candles." It's continuing with that more grounded, more introspective take on Spider-Man, but it's also a wild, high-octane, fast-paced, mad, absurd action piece. It's about lots of different ideas: time and mortality, social ostracism, family legacy, loyalty to family and friends, safety versus being happy, and all the usual power and responsibility stuff. It should be a deep, layered piece to unpack, but some of those ideas are more interesting on paper than the way they're executed. Some of them, like the time motif, are laid on too thick, and too often the movie isn't naturally exploring its ideas through an organic, character-driven story. The movie's themes often feel stacked on, like toppings on a pizza, rather than blended in like ingredients in a smoothie. That's what The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is, a supreme pizza with all the toppings, whether they make sense together or not. The risk you run when you try to feed everyone everything is that while there might be technically something there for everyone, the combined taste you get when you put it all together might not be to too many people's liking at all. I scratched my head really hard when this movie first came out, trying to understand why a lot of fans hated it with such a fiery passion. As I said, I think it's deeply flawed and has a massive identity crisis, but I didn't think it was offensively bad. I don't even think it's the worst of the Spider-Man films. It weirdly shares some of my issues with Spider-Man 3. Unconvincing villain motivations, too many rushed plot threads, uneven pacing. They're both built on some massive plot conveniences. They've both really overstayed their welcome by the end, and they both have morals that are spelled out, but not organically arrived to in the story. They both have two villains that aren't interesting together and are begging for their own movies. They both make really bizarre choices with Harry Osborn, and Harry makes a laughably melodramatic turn by the end of both. But Spider-Man isn't a murderer here who gets to pretend like he's learned from his mistakes because nobody actually died. I don't want to see both Peter and his love interest boiled alive in every scene they're in together, and there's some legitimately compelling stuff in Peter's character arc about learning when it's the responsible thing not to act, and learning when you have to let people you care about take their own risks, to be responsible with their own power. I honestly did not understand the venomous reaction the fan community in general seemed to have to this movie when it came out. And I'm not saying it's a great film because I think it's better than Spider-Man 3. I compare them because I think that's an offensively bad film, and this one is just supremely problematic. But with a little hindsight, I think I might see where folks were coming from. Perhaps it's a lot worse to have a movie this messy and bloated after a movie people already weren't won over by than it is to have a bad sequel to a movie that was almost universally praised, especially since we all walked out of Spider-Man 3 expecting a Spider-Man 4, and so there was hope for better things to come. Somewhat ironically, we all walked out of The Amazing Spider-Man 2 having been blatantly sold another sequel about the Sinister Six, and because fans that maybe didn't care for the last one left now decisively unimpressed with this version, it was worse knowing we were stuck with this continuity for the foreseeable future, and Sony was just going to keep shoving it down our throats whether we wanted it or not, with talks of not only more Spider-Man to come, but a shared universe that would give the Sinister Six their own film, and Venom, and maybe Aunt May? Ah, the juicy news days of the Sony hack. The movie's most egregious sin was perhaps that it was sold to us like it was the second coming of Christ. It supplanted a franchise a lot of people liked better. I mean, not me, but what do I know? It didn't deliver, but had the audacity to expect its audience to be stoked about what was to come. The artificial attempt at Raimiing it up with the over-the-top villains and brighter color palette didn't satiate fans who didn't like Amazing. And there were some viewers, like me, who liked a lot of things about the last installment and felt like this one often hardly felt like it took place in the same world. Personally, I didn't think it was unsalvageable and would have liked to have seen the story allowed to finish. Who knows if Sony would have learned from its mistakes here, but with a better writing team and less studio meddling, Marc Webb, assuming he agreed to return, might have had a chance to find that perfect blend of character study and comic book action. It's all a moot point now, of course, because like with Spider-Man 3, the franchise was abandoned, although for totally different reasons, in favor of a reboot. At least Raimi's trilogy, such as it was a true trilogy, at least so far as the Harry Osborn arc was concerned, and it didn't leave any dangling story threads. I imagine this franchise, unfinished and widely unloved, will be largely buried and forgotten in the years to come. Unless it gets superpowers in a horrible accident, gets shown on the Jumbotrons in Times Square, and tries to murder us all. At the risk of continuing my reputation for comparing everything to the Nolan Batman trilogy, I want to briefly mention The Dark Knight here, not to start an argument about whether steak is tastier than pizza, and not just as an example of another sequel that had to win over an audience that might not have been excited about its version of its superhero, or more often, just hadn't gotten around to sampling it yet, and succeeded, but also because I think this movie is, oddly, like The Dark Knight if it had been a complete mess. It's difficult to know if the filmmakers and studio were looking at that film when they made this, but they have a strange number of things in common, both in structure and narrative. Both movies are quite a bit longer than your average superhero movie. The Dark Knight clocks in at 2:45, and Amazing 2 clocks in at 2:22, but it feels like 2:45. They each feature a primary villain through most of the film who's taken out in a false climax that feels like the end of the film. But then the real climax features a showdown with a new villain that was created throughout the course of the film. That other villain is a close friend of the hero, feels betrayed by him, becomes disfigured, loses his mind, and tries to kill and/or punish the hero. The love of the hero's life is kidnapped and tragically killed by a villain, but not directly at said villain's hands, although that happens at different points in each movie, and not by the analogous villains. That's right, for our purposes here, Electro is the Joker, and Green Goblin is Two-Face. Both movies are about whether or not their respective hero is setting an example of hope, or whether his superheroics are detrimental to society. One of these is more effective at that than the other. They each include a heavy-handed speech that comes right out and says what the movie's about. The Dark Knight's is brief, more about spelling out the symbolism than screaming the moral lesson, and doesn't happen until the very end. I'm not saying Amazing 2 is a carbon copy of The Dark Knight, but I'm a little suspicious of the parallels, and I wonder if at least some of that wasn't intentional, particularly the formula of the friend who becomes a villain and doesn't have a showdown with the hero until the first villain has been dispatched of. Was Sony attempting to make what happened with the Batman franchise naturally work for them artificially? Were they consciously trying to make a big event movie people would love despite whether they saw the first one, and a movie that people would discuss as this really deep, meaningful, important film? The self-serious comic book movie was, after all, more in vogue as this movie was being made than it was during Amazing Spider-Man's production. It's certainly more of a direct sequel than The Dark Knight was, because it's the next chapter in a blossoming but doomed romance, and because it tries to pay off that oh-so-fascinating mystery about Peter's parents and his Spider-Man destiny. But that stuff might have been obligatory, so it didn't look like a soft reboot. And I imagine Marc Webb was attached to that stuff and didn't want to make an entirely different sort of Spider-Man movie, even though it sometimes feels like it. It is certainly advertised like it's the most important movie of the year. Like if you don't see this thing, you won't be prepared when the rapture happens. The Dark Knight was advertised like the one thing a politically divided nation should be able to come together over that year because the people behind it were really confident in what they had, and it turned out, for most of us, to totally live up to the hype. It didn't reek of desperation like this movie did, with so many long trailers I felt like I'd already seen the film. Warner's also didn't have a whole film division in total crisis like Sony did, and continues to have. No matter what this movie ultimately looked like, something is truly wrong in the state of Denmark when you have a whopping 4.5-minute trailer and you show the final shot of the film in it. My absolute favorite thing about this entire movie is the ending, with the kid inspired by Spider-Man who tries to take on the Rhino all by himself because Spider-Man seems to be no more. Choked me up on this viewing the same way it did in the theater. But then I was totally taken out when I realized I'd seen that manhole cover throw before. What an awesome image to be left with at the very end. Spidey's back despite his tragic loss. He's upholding his responsibility and continuing to inspire. He's already starting to take on one of the inevitable members of the Sinister Six, and this is what you can look forward to in the next one. It's more of a status quo establishment before it's a true cliffhanger. Kind of the opposite of what we get at the end of The Dark Knight, and I love that. And I'd have loved it a lot more if that image hadn't been spoiled for me already with the trailer. I mean, sure, I could just avoid every trailer. I'm gonna go to these things anyway. But trailers are one of the primary ways studios convince people to spend their hard-earned cash to see these movies. So it's super unfair to entice someone to buy a ticket with material that might ruin their experience. It's like being penalized for buying into marketing. If only you avoided what we spend millions of dollars to show you, which is harder and harder in this age where video ads are on your desktop and in your pocket and soon to be directly beamed into your brain, you'd enjoy our film more, a film you might not have seen if it weren't for the trailer/full-blown preview that showed you the final shot of the movie. There are several toppings on this pizza I like a lot, and even some I think taste okay together. I think there are any number of excellent movies sitting on top of this mess of cheese and pepperoni and sausage and anchovies and marshmallows and liverwurst. The problem is they were all made at the same time and called The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Which, side note, is, for whatever reason, a totally lame title. There's something about putting a 2 after a title with a moniker like that that really bugs me. This might just be a me thing. Maybe it's just because it's rarely done, but usually descriptors, either before or after the titular character's name, are what make the title of the piece unique. I kinda doubt if there were a sequel to The Incredible Hulk, it would be called The Incredible Hulk 2. It might have been a shame to waste the other popular monikers on other entries in this franchise in case there was ever another reboot, but a lot of fans were expecting the sequel to be called Spectacular or Web of or one of those. Considering Peter's constant struggle in trying to balance his personal life with his crime fighting, or whether it's even okay to have a personal life at all if he's going to put himself in danger all the time, Peter Parker Spider-Man might have been a good title for this one. I don't know, I thought The Amazing Spider-Man 2 was a working title until we had a poster or a trailer, and then I was like, hope that doesn't reflect a lack of creativity in the film. The best idea in the movie, the one that comes closest to being the thematic glue that holds everything together, is the notion that living a responsible life, thinking about how your actions impact other people, rather than only thinking about yourself, is always complicated. That idea permeates through every subplot. It naturally builds off the events from the last film, primarily Connor's insane lizard therapy for humanity project, where he tries to solve all of humanity's problems in one fell swoop and almost robs everyone of their humanity. And it's not so heavy-handed like the life is precious because it ends and let's all become hope speech. It's also classic Spider-Man. Peter's life is never simple because he always has the world on his shoulders. As he learns when his inaction leads to Uncle Ben's death, he makes the biggest mistakes when he tries to make easy living his primary mission. That's sort of what Connor's did too, and it's what both of our villains do here. Max Dillon wants to be noticed and loved, but he's not willing to do what it would take to make that happen. He's antisocial and creepy, and people don't like to be around him because he's so self-absorbed and trying too hard. He may be brilliant, and sure, it's not right that Oscorp took advantage of him and used his blueprints for the power grid without giving him credit or compensation, but he doesn't realize that he's still standing in his own way, and he wants success without fighting for it. By the time he gets superpowers, he's too far gone, and he's not interested in complex human relationships, only people people seeing him. And then, when he gets even more delusional and gets jealous of Spider-Man for having that notoriety and fame already, he makes it all about fame. If I can't have what I want, no one can. And power entitles him to do that. As simple as it gets, and so the total opposite of responsible. Harry is also looking for an easy way out of his problems, just like his father did. He doesn't like that his dad was never around for him growing up, and like Lex Luthor on Smallville, he doesn't want to become his father, but he's well on his way, out of desperation rather than a thirst for power. Unlike Max, it doesn't matter how much power he has, it won't get him what he needs, a cure for his illness. When he reconnects with Peter and asks if he has a girlfriend, Peter feeds him the standard movie line about sordid dramatic relationships. It's complicated. Harry says, "I don't do complicated." And it's that attitude that gets him in massive trouble later. When he finds out he's dying, he looks for a quick fix in Spider-Man's blood, which is, of course, reckless and irresponsible and also totally insane. But he's so afraid to die and so angry at Oscorp's board for trying to shut him out that he allows his rage to consume him, gets totally wrapped up in himself, and gets paranoid. If you don't think his rash ideas are a good idea, you must want him to fail. He's gotten the short end of the stick, no question, but that doesn't make it right for him to risk hurting other people to save his own life. And things don't get any less complicated for him when he tries to cut corners. By the end, he ends up with a Jekyll-Hyde condition that sometimes turns him into a snarling beast and ends up killing his best friend's girlfriend. He's lost his company and everything he had, and he's in prison. You can't go through your life trying to make things easier for yourself at the expense of others. Not only is it really mean, but it doesn't work. Peter is in an impossible place with Gwen. He can't decide if it's more right to stay away from her, to protect her from harm, or to be with her and fly in the face of the promise he says he made to Captain Stacy, though Stacy's final request can be interpreted in a number of ways, as I talked about in the Amazing Spider-Man review, and Peter never actually said whether he'd follow his wishes one way or another. He goes back and forth on it throughout the movie, and an indecisive, brooding, and non-proactive protagonist usually irritates me, but I can sympathize in this case, although he stretches my patience right up to the edge of sympathy. I like that it's not all about him, or at least he doesn't think it is. He can't make a decision because he's trying to do what's right. If he and Gwen continue their lives together, he's ignoring the last wishes of a hero he admired, feels somewhat responsible for getting killed, and the father of the woman he loves. And he risks her getting caught in the crossfire, not just because his enemies might use her as leverage over him, which was the main concern of Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man dating Mary Jane, but also because Gwen won't just sit on the sidelines. She'll insist on getting involved in his missions. If he chooses not to be with her, he forfeits his own happiness and hers. It may not be his responsibility to make her happy at the expense of his own happiness, but it also may not be his responsibility to keep her safe if she's willing to take her own risks. And unfair of him to not allow her to have what she wants, especially when it's in line with what he wants, only because he's afraid of taking the chance. It boils down to two questions. What's more important, that Gwen lives, or that she lives the way she wants for as long as she has? And if he decides not to date her just to, in his mind, save her, is that for her, or is that for him? When he tells her he can't continue being with her after graduation, she asks him, who does that work out for? And his reason sounds selfish, though I don't think he realizes it. He thinks he's just trying to protect her, but he says he can't lose her. So she breaks it off with him, so he can't keep yo-yoing her around, and I really like that. On the relationship side, these characters still mostly feel like real, reasonable people to me, who aren't entitled and selfish and uncompromising, while the film tells us that's endearing, like Peter and Mary Jane in the Raimi movies. Peter is stringing her along. He's making a mistake. He is making it too much about himself. But his pickle is understandable, and so I get how he wound up in that trap. There are consequences to his treating Gwen that way, and he learns and grows from it. I also like that through this, we find he still has plenty to learn about being a responsible person. He isn't magically the most accountable and together person on the planet just because he went through an origin story that centers around the notion of personal responsibility. I even like that he's starting to act a little more like his villains when Gwen's about to move to England and Harry drops this impossible request on him for his blood. He doesn't know how to handle these situations without his ever level-headed sidekick. He starts to get wrapped up in himself and his own problems, just like Harry is, and he realizes he's starting to negatively affect the person he's so desperate not to lose. When he follows her into the Oxford office, won't stop rambling about his dilemma with Harry, and risks ruining her reputation with the interviewer who's about to decide whether she's getting the fellowship. And as obnoxiously foreshadowed and contrived as it is, I like that Gwen's death is a direct consequence of her actions. Peter and her father were right. There was a good chance she might get hurt or killed if he didn't leave her out of it. But as she says, it was her choice to make, and because, for her, helping to save the city from Electra was worth the risk, Peter made the right choice to live his life the way he wants and to allow her to do the same. I even like that he's still trying to stop her from helping him after he's fully committed to their relationship, agreeing to compromise and come with her to London so they can be together. It's not a light switch. Just like in the first film, he hasn't figured everything out because of one moment of epiphany. But in the end, the movie is saying that he did the right thing in being a part of her life when they had a really strong foundation and were brilliantly compatible otherwise. And I think their chemistry continues to shine through this movie, and I continue to appreciate why they're so made for each other. In the end, he accepts that life is always complicated, whether you do the right thing or not, so you can't live your life trying to make it simple. To be responsible is to make personal sacrifices. So now let me springboard from there to address a couple of the biggest complaints fans tend to lob at the Peter-Gwen relationship. First, Denis Leary leering around every corner, guilt-tripping Peter, and perpetuating this dilemma about whether they should be together. Some people don't like that because it's too close to a ghost or hallucination gimmick. In real life, people don't tend to actually see the personification of their remorse everywhere they go unless something is seriously wrong with them mentally. And the film isn't playing Peter as being so far gone, although even if he were losing his mind, both of his villains are so out of their gourds, he'd still look perfectly well-adjusted next to them. It's not anything like as outlandish as Peter having a whole conversation with Uncle Ben in a car on a blank white void after he's dead, but having Peter straight up tell Gwen that he's seeing her father everywhere is maybe going a little farther than it needs to. I would have loved the subtlety of that simply being a visualization of his guilt, like the floating heads in the comics, and leaving it ambiguous as to whether he's actually literally seeing that. But clearly, subtlety of any kind is too much to ask for with this movie. It still doesn't quite press my suspension of disbelief buttons, though. I buy that he keeps seeing Captain Stacy, maybe not as a hallucination, but just in the sense that, as he says, he can't get him out of his head. My issue with it is how it's used to shove us to a break in status quo right at the beginning of the movie. It's used like the impetus to push Peter to a decision, and that I'm not buying. Is he only just now seeing ghosty Denis Leary, or has it been happening the entire time he's been going back and forth with Gwen? Is it supposed to be worse on graduation day because Gwen's father wasn't there to see her graduate, or because they're moving into the next chapter of their lives together and Peter is terrified he's doing the wrong thing? Maybe more discussion about the timing might have made that feel less sudden. He was having a great time stopping a heist as Spider-Man, clearly had no intention of breaking up with his girlfriend that day, and then all of a sudden, Denis Leary out of nowhere, and he's down for the count. And I know they've broken it off and gotten back together a few times, but it watches too much like this is the time Gwen's had enough, and it's going to stick because the movie just started, and that's a tense, dramatic scene the filmmakers want in the movie. Now, I'm not going to defend the stalking thing, because I'm honestly not sure how I feel about that. When Gwen invites Peter out to tell him she's moving to England, he slips up and mentions a restaurant he shouldn't know she's been visiting lately. She then realizes he's been following her. He says once a day, sometimes more. And she doesn't seem to mind. In fact, she seems to find it downright charming, flattering. I'll admit, it's the closest a movie has ever come to making me okay with a guy following a girl around without her knowledge. Again, he is in an impossible situation. They were in a super serious relationship, and they both really want to be together. When he says this is the closest he can get to still being with her, I'm surprisingly not looking at him like a total creepazoid, because she's not looking at him that way. Now, if you want to say that's out of character or she's unrealistically reasonable there, that's totally fair. But these two people have a unique, one-of-a-kind relationship. They're best friends as much as they're lovers, perhaps more so. That doesn't make invading anybody's privacy okay, and it's odd that the movie seems to be saying, in this instance, he didn't do anything wrong, or it's so understandable it's like he did nothing wrong. He does pay for some mistakes in this movie, and this isn't one of them. But I don't have the same reaction I did with, say, the stalking in Superman Returns. I'd buy this kid doing that before I'd buy the always morally upstanding, allegedly Christopher Reeve version of Superman doing it. I promise I'm gonna start pulling off some of the pizza toppings and throwing them in the cheese grater, but before I do, I want to mention a few other miscellaneous elements I really like, whether they're well blended or not. I love Paul Giamatti as GHESTBUSTERS, and one of the true crimes in not seeing the series continue is that we'll never get more giant mech suit rhino nuttiness. He's having the time of his life, playing a role he'd apparently been dying to play forever, and it's infectious. As Spider-Man is basking in the thrill of web slinging and saving lives, he's having just as much fun doing the opposite. His introduction during the manic, choppy armored car chase at the beginning was both massively entertaining and really worrisome for me in the theater. It was, at the time, some of the most bombastic craziness we'd seen in a superhero movie, and it didn't remotely match the tone of the first one or the teaser. For a second, I thought I was watching RoboCop. Maybe it would have been less jarring if it was right up front, but at least it wasn't 20 minutes into a movie that otherwise felt like it belonged in the universe we visited last time. I could totally live with a Spider-Man world this heightened and insane, and it's not that far off from how far we went with Green Goblin in the first Raimi film. Again, I think this was one of the bones thrown to Raimi fans, and it might have worked if we got here more gradually, and if it didn't feel like I was watching two different movies simultaneously. I also like GHESTBUSTERS because we finally get a minor C-list villain fight in a Spider-Man movie. That's a big thing in Spider-Man stories. Sometimes he'll take down a low-level villain in the middle of dealing with an unrelated, more pressing bad guy scheme. Of course, this guy has to bookend it and be drafted by the big dogs and graduate to major bad guy status by the end, but it was a good start. I like that this is a Peter who loves being Spider-Man, and that we get to share in that thrill and marvel at that spectacle. The web swinging is treated with a sense of jubilation and majesty, and a lot of it, especially right at the beginning, is breathtaking and beautifully rendered. I still don't know how I feel about the choice of first-person perspective web swinging. I get it, it's supposed to make you feel what it's like, and it's supposed to look cool in 3D, and it's just impressive we can do that now. But it also feels like a video game, and screams, we're in an action scene now, don't expect any story to be told. Imagine if we suddenly switched to the first person every time the Punisher was shooting guns. Everyone would be like, I went to see The Punisher, and I left feeling like I just logged a couple hours playing Call of Duty. But I can't deny how spectacular and amazing it is to look at, and it's far superior to anything that had come before. This is another thing I wish hadn't been in all the trailers, but that opening action shot you think is just the Spider logo, and then you realize you're looking at the back of Spider-Man's costume as he's falling, is just thrilling. And that's one of the places where Zimmer's new brass-heavy fanfare, which I'm overall lukewarm on, really works. There's a bit of score that uses a device I'd never seen employed before and just marveled at the innovation of, and that's the escalation of chanting the paranoid and schizophrenic thoughts in Max's head in Times Square when he loses it and decides Spider-Man's betrayed their friendship. That's a really inventive way to get into a character's mind. It fits wonderfully with his villain motif, as it sounds electric and staticky, and it's downright haunting. Even after he gets his powers, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to pity Electro, be terrified of him, or laugh at him. But for the brief moments he's building to his boiling point, and the tension is rising through that score, I feel like I'm looking at a menacing perversion of humanity society has ruined by taking advantage of him, and then throwing him away. And I wish the movie itself didn't throw him away, totally wasting a character I saw some real potential for. I also like the genuine on-screen chemistry between Andrew Garfield and Dane DeHaan as Harry Osborn, and between Garfield and Sally Field as Aunt May. I really believe Peter and Harry used to be friends, and both actors do a superb job of playing kids from different worlds who have a lot undeniably in common that ties them together. The movie teeters on the edge between rushing through scenes and sitting in one place for too long, and I do think there's far too much improvisation left in. That scene where Peter tells the Oxford interviewer he's from Harvard is cringe-inducing, but one scene that naturally breathes and where I'm seeing characters come alive is when Peter's about to leave Harry's house and Harry finally lets his armor crack a bit. I wasn't sure I bought this retroactively added childhood friendship until Peter lets himself go and says, "There he is." It's all the more disappointing when Harry suddenly has a ticking time bomb for no reason, in insisting Spider-Man gives him his blood. If I hated Harry from the beginning and his relationship with Peter didn't work at all, I at least wouldn't have any investment, and I could just roll my eyes and dismiss this whole thing as phoned-in garbage. But I let myself get at least marginally invested, so all that sucks way more. And Sally Field gets a nice amount of screen time here, appropriately now that Ben's died, and while some of her scenes are also places I might have appreciated tighter scripted dialogue rather than ad-libs. I don't know, I think this Peter is better than I was cleaning the chimney, but then again, I don't know if we're seeing Kurtzman or... Peter and May have a distinct rapport, and Field does a great job making it clear that she's not an idiot and suspects Peter's Spider-Man all the way through, but gives him space and lets him figure that part of his life out on his own, until she makes it pretty clear in her comments 5 months after Gwen's death that she knows, and she thinks he really should be answering the call. Sorry, I've just got poorly reviewed and awkwardly advertised Sony movies on the brain right now. And now, it's time to scrape this pie down to the crust. First off, let's talk about the mystery with Richard and Mary Parker. I already didn't love the idea that Peter was destined to be Spider-Man because his father created the radioactive spider. I mean, at least Richard didn't have some crazy elaborate scheme to give his child spider powers all along, but it felt like an overly elaborate plot just to do something different with the origin. Because it's played as an important part of Peter's beginnings, he needs the answers to in the first film, as if the full scope of his origin story isn't quite over and there's still something he has to learn from his father as well as Uncle Ben. This movie is kind of stuck with the burden of answering those questions, regardless of how curious anyone in the audience really is about them. While I was open-minded and prepared for that to be a compelling revelation, I certainly wasn't chomping at the bit to know what happened to the Parkers, nor was I confident that Webb or any of the 79 people involved with the script writing process even knew what the answer was. I certainly wasn't confident that whatever it turned out to be, it would be satisfying, given how much of the plotting last movie was built on a series of story conveniences. We didn't exactly have grandmasters of yarn weaving last time around, and the Star Trek Into Darkness guys wrote this, so I really wasn't expecting anything. And wouldn't you know it, not only are the answers to Peter's big questions less than provocative, but they make the events that lead to Peter getting his powers even more contrived than they were before. Richard Parker was helping Norman Osborn experiment on spiders to get their self-healing properties because Osborn was dying of a super rare illness called retroviral hypodysplasia, and no, that's not a real disease. Parker realized he made a ginormous mistake in helping Osborn with that research when he realizes Osborn is selling it to some ambiguous foreign country to weaponize it in order to keep his funding going, I guess. I mean, we need some excuse, so Richard must double-cross Osborn, become a fugitive, and have to leave his son with Ben and May. But the really contrived part is that Richard mixed in his own blood for the human trials so it couldn't be used by anyone else in case it landed in the wrong hands. He made it so the only people it would actually be stable with, and who would get a healing factor, I guess he didn't know about the other side effect powers, were members of his own family. That means that theoretically he could have cured Osborn if he'd wanted to. He could have only used Osborn's blood and refused to give it to that unidentified foreign power, but let's call it Russia, so he could save Norman, and he wouldn't have any reason to give an enemy of the United States a potentially devastating bioweapon. That's the only reason Norman was doing that, right? So why not just say, look, Norman, I think I can cure you, but I'm not comfortable giving the cure to anyone else. It's stable. Why don't we try it on you, and if it works, we can destroy it so it doesn't fall in the wrong hands. You won't need that money for more research, and then the Russians, whatever untrustworthy foreign power, won't get their hands on a horrible weapon. Sure, that's not the most moral thing to do. It wouldn't be right for Norman to use the cure for himself and give no one else access to it. But if you're Richard Parker, it's either that or go on the run. And I guess he didn't think of my idea, so he just goes on the run. Also, what he did was way worse. He intentionally created a version of the Venom that would be totally unstable for almost everyone on the planet if they used it. Maybe he didn't do enough tests and didn't know exactly what it would do, but in an attempt to stop the Venom from being weaponized, he totally handed Osborn a weaponized version. As far as I can tell, the venom from the spider that bit Peter and the green formula Harry injects himself with are exactly the same thing. So Richard Parker created a formula that turns people into monsters instead of either cutting a deal with Norman to give him the cure that works or just lying and saying he can't figure the formula out, period, which is what Connors thought last movie when he was trying to crack the 00 formula. Also that the spider bite, previously just a simple conceit to give our hero his superpowers, plays as a consequence of his father's own lack of responsibility. Now that's an idea I might like if it wasn't so totally implausible, and if it didn't make his dad look like an idiot rather than just a misguided or eager scientist. And now it's way worse that in the first movie, Peter happens to stumble on the location of the spider room because of Osborn's clumsy assistant, who drops a folder and Peter recognizes the double zeros. Not only is it ridiculous that he finds that room, but now he's the only person on the planet, besides maybe Uncle Ben, who would have gotten powers from that spider bite. Oh, and the Roosevelt train car that comes up from the ground like a supervillain secret headquarters is way too whimsical for the world we established last movie. The way Peter finds the train tokens and puts that together is stereotypically convenient. When all else fails, have somebody break something in anger and then discover the key to progress the story. And this is absurdly minor. But I don't know if Richard's train car computer knows what the word download means, or if we're actually supposed to believe that the information he tried to send from the airplane to that computer was really just hanging in cyberspace for all those years. And how old was Peter? 9? And he's 18 now? Yeah, planes didn't have Wi-Fi circa 2000, 2001. I don't know, maybe Osborn was so cutting edge he had it, but nobody else did. He does have, after all, the only company in America with giant holographic presentations in his foyer. I do like this Sins of the Fathers idea in intertwining Peter and Harry's backgrounds. They're both inexplicably informed by choices their fathers both made on the same project. Though they were raised in entirely different environments, they understand each other. Their fathers both abandoned them, both sacrificed them for their experiments. I like that line from Norman. He tells Harry his childhood had to be sacrificed. Responsibility requires personal sacrifice, as we talked about before. Norman uses everyone as a means to his ends, only caring about his own survival. And so it's everyone else who must sacrifice so that he can live on. I mean, he says he knew it was hereditary and he did it for Harry too, but I take that with a grain of salt. Though I'd love to know what his ambitions might be beyond his own survival. He's a ruthless pragmatist. Surely he has other goals beyond not dying that help fuel his obsession with his own mortality. And if a third movie had been made, we might have discovered what those goals were. One of the many deleted scenes from yet another movie that seemed like a much different project while it was shooting than it ended up being in the theater, according to numerous sources including Webb and Garfield, revealed that Norman wasn't dead, but was reduced to a disembodied head floating in a jar. That was supposed to be an after-credit scene, and I have no idea why it was cut. I spent the whole movie assuming he wasn't really dead, was surprised we never got back to him, and then learned later we were supposed to. Anyway, Harry's lack of fatherly guidance and his resentment toward his father lead him, naturally, to a skewed perspective of the world. He doesn't see the hope for the future Peter does in regular, everyday people trying to help each other and setting a good example, like he tries to do with Spider-Man. Harry sees the world as a harsh jungle you have to be strong enough to survive, every man for himself. And Peter might have seen it that way himself, if not for the fortune of being raised by a couple with strong values. The contrast in their upbringings should come much earlier in the film. Harry doesn't appear until the tail end of the first act, and the teaser with Peter's father is too long and totally unnecessary. We don't need to see that whole opening scene from the first film from Richard's perspective, especially because it doesn't really peel the curtain back yet. I don't know any more about what he's doing than I did when I got it from Peter's POV. It's not until we get the whole message in the subway car I'm convinced was built by Donatello from the Ninja Turtles that we get any pertinent information. I think that's partly why the big revelation is such a letdown. We're asking more questions throughout the whole movie rather than getting any answers to the ones posed in the previous film. Instead of that opening scene, I think we should have gotten a funeral scene with young Peter and Harry. Give us that relationship at the outset so it doesn't feel so much like an afterthought when we finally get to it. And this isn't me rewriting the movie. According to the producer and writer commentary, such a scene was written, and it was excised because they decided it was redundant. I mean, sure, I'm a stickler for avoiding flashbacks whenever possible, but if you're establishing a pattern where you open every movie with a flashback anyway, it might as well be something that would really inform a relationship we didn't know about until this movie, especially if you're not going to get to Harry until like 40 minutes in. The real problems with Harry begin as soon as he tells Peter he wants Spider-Man's blood. Right away, he's gone from sympathetic rich kid with too much on his plate, a dead dad, and a debilitating illness, to a crazed lunatic who's already lost his mind before he ever injects himself with anything. Seriously, it's like finding out he was going to get giant monster fingers made him start acting like he'd already grown giant monster fingers. Like, that knowledge itself is his supervillain origin story. Sure, he knows he's gonna die and he's panicking and he's not thinking straight. And if he said this and then took the time to think it through and later apologized for that erratic, irrational moment, I totally believe it. But this is forced drama of the worst kind, and it's just as bad as the previous Harry's "I hate you for killing my father, but I'm not interested in your side of the story, and I'm not going to have a conversation with you about it so I can keep wallowing in self-pity and grief and operate from a position of ignorance until I killed you," which is also, by the way, before he ever injects himself with anything. This is essentially your big first act plot point, and it doesn't work at all. Number one, Harry is acting like he's going to die tomorrow, even though he has the sum total of his father's research. Norman looks like he's in his mid-50s, pushing 60, and the onset of the disease happened precisely at the same age for him in precisely the same way. It totally sucks, and he obviously needs to keep that research going, but he has the same means to prolong his life that Norman did, presumably. There is that thing about all the animal testing centers getting shut down after the lizard incident, so perhaps he can't do much of what Norman did for himself without those, but we're not told that. It would help to explain why Harry is so insanely desperate and ready to try any crazy, dangerous procedure. Secondly, Harry gets angry with Peter, and then later with Spider-Man for not immediately saying, "Oh yeah, that's a great idea. Let's just transfuse my blood into you with no research or trials whatsoever and see what happens." When Spider-Man shows up to refuse, Harry acts like he's out to get him, like he just doesn't want him to get better, and this is before the board shuts him out. So there's nothing that should get him that paranoid. And again, I get it, survival instinct is the only thing driving him right now, but it's totally unbelievable unless his mind is being affected by his disease, that he's not hearing Spider-Man out and at least running some tests before they try it. After all, Spider-Man doesn't say no, he says not yet. Third, Harry keeps cheating and reading the script, but claiming he knows things about Peter and Spider-Man some other totally preposterous way. Apparently, there was supposed to be a whole thing about Oscorp tracking Spider-Man that would have explained why Harry knew Peter was Spider-Man by the end, and it was in some of the trailers, but it was probably dropped so this movie that feels like it's 3 hours long wasn't actually 3 hours long. In this scene, Harry is positive Peter knows Spider-Man personally because he took a picture of him for the Bugle. He would only even think of that if Peter had published lots of pictures of Spider-Man and if they clearly could only be gotten by someone with professional relationship to Spider-Man. Peter says he took that picture with a long lens, and it really looks like that's what he did, so it's insane that Harry even thinks they must, obviously, have a relationship, much less to keep hounding Peter until he finally admits to it. And then we have that totally hackneyed ending, where Harry is broken into Oscorp after he was framed for covering up Max Dillon's death. Harry's taken the formula, hoping it would cure him, turned into a temporary monster just long enough to fly around and kill Peter's girlfriend because she's Gwen Stacy, and that has to happen, and it has to be a goblin that does it. And after Spider-Man and Gwen have murdered Electro, Harry shows up to kill Spider-Man for no earthly reason. By the way, their murdering Electro is fine. It's the only way to stop him, but it's funny neither of them seem remotely disheartened by having to do it. Harry says the reason he's after Spider-Man is because he betrayed him. It's revenge. But it's really because we have another villain that needs a climactic fight scene, and Green Goblin kills Gwen Stacy. That's the rule. That's why he arbitrarily picks that costume and the glider under the number 7 in the secret evil weapon lab, and conveniently, it's a 7 and not a number between 1 and 6, because Green Goblin isn't part of the Sinister Six, and we're cleverly and subtly foreshadowing that that's the next big villain thing on the horizon. The events of the third act are really propelled forward, well, by choices characters are making. Harry's mad at Peter because he wouldn't give him his blood, which he thought would cure him, and which Peter was worried would turn him into an irrational, brutish monster thing, like a variation on it did to Connor's. And Harry's ticked because of what's happened to him in his mind as a result of Peter's betrayal. Harry didn't listen to Peter, used the exact same formula he would have gotten from him, and turned into an irrational, brutish monster thing. So he wants to punish Peter by murdering his girlfriend, because Peter didn't help prevent him from transforming into a hideous beast, by transforming him into a hideous beast. He also has a ridiculous speech about how Spider-Man doesn't give people hope, and that's just a lame attempt at trying to pay off earlier dialogue and make it feel more tragic because these guys had opposing ideologies and now they're at loggerheads. Yeah, X-Men First Class, this is not. Maybe he's just lashing out because there was no hope, and he hates Peter for being so positive in a world where, as he sees it, everyone is out to get him. But that's not how it plays, and I'm not sure what, if anything, the scene is getting at. I don't want to give it too much credit. Either Harry is just a crazy person now, and making up nutso rationale for his actions on the spot, or I'm really supposed to think that if only Peter had been more sympathetic to Harry's plight, this all could have gone down differently. The former is the only thing that makes anything resembling the basic cellular structure of sense. But you know what doesn't make sense? Knowing Peter is Spider-Man because he said Spider-Man gives people hope. The man has a positive opinion about the city's superhero, and that makes him that superhero. That would be like if I said the unknown comic from The Gong Show makes people laugh, and people started going, wow, he thinks the unknown comic is funny. Maybe he is the unknown comic. I mean, that could just be something he's saying because he's out of his mind, too. I imagine him just seeing Gwen standing there and knowing she and Peter are an item and just assumes Peter must be Spider-Man, which is infinitely more plausible. But he just says something nuts because he's nuts. Because, you know, he ran into an elevator that one time and knows what Gwen looks like. Why have a line there at all? Why not just have him look at Gwen, put two and two together, do that creepy smile thing, and then have at it? And a quick side note. This movie and freaking chance elevator encounters. Oscorp is huge. It has to be. It's the source of all the conflict in this universe. You've got a jillion floors, but Gwen keeps running into our villains before they become villains, and these scenes pretend like they matter, but both of them could be cut entirely. Gwen happens to ride the elevator with Max so that they've met at some point in this movie. It's not so she'll sympathize with him more when he becomes a supervillain, and it's not so that he can do anything to her later. They're in the same big locations later, but they never have another exchange. All it really does is continue to drive home that Max is socially awkward, loves Spider-Man, and is in denial about his own popularity. Then later, Harry runs into Gwen on the elevator, and this scene is played as more deliberate, like maybe he somehow made sure he was on that elevator just as she boarded it, so he could give her the hint that she needs to convince Peter to make Spider-Man give him his blood. But that whole thing never pays off. She doesn't tell Peter about it, Harry doesn't blame her for not delivering the message, just totally dropped. The only thing it does do is tell Harry what she looks like so he can look at her and deduce that Peter is Spider-Man toward the end. But if he's to be believed, he could have gotten there with his own brilliant deductive reasoning skills, because as everyone knows, if you think someone wearing a mask is a good thing, you probably are that person. Although I guess that one woman in The Dark Knight kind of had that line of logic with Harvey Dent. See? They're the same movie. Electro is completely uninteresting, unfunny, not scary except when there's certain music playing, and is as superfluous to this story as Sandman is to Spider-Man 3. And like Sandman, they're both the first and principal villain for more than half the film. The difference is, if he were retooled to be less of a cartoon character, and I understood how he became such an extreme, mentally unstable personality, he might be able to carry his own film. But it would certainly be a different film. His insecurities and motivations don't really thematically connect to Harry's, try as the film might to force those puzzle pieces together. And unlike Harry, he's not that interesting to contrast to this Peter Parker. Sure, traditional Peter Parker is a similar kind of outcast, who isn't given the time of day, was bullied in high school, and easily could have become a raving lunatic with superpowers if he wasn't raised with the right values. But this Peter Parker started out as a volunteer outcast. He kept to himself, didn't really want to deal with people, and only had dealings with bullies when he stood up for other kids. Like with Kurt Connors, there's a deleted scene that would have given him a family, a mother that doesn't nurture him and seems to have never loved him. But it wouldn't have added much except to give him an obvious anti-May and Uncle Ben. There's not a lot in Max for this Peter to relate to, until toward the end when he finds out his father was taken advantage of by Oscorp like Max was, and maybe something could have been done with that, but it's not brought to the fore, and I doubt if Peter even thinks of it himself. I like the idea of one of those drones in the Oscorp catacomb building being pushed too far and losing it on Oscorp. But that's not the primary focus of his anger, and every time it's mentioned, I'm like, oh yeah, that's right, they stole his blueprints. It's even an afterthought when Harry is goading him on later. He wants to kill Spider-Man, oh, and all he really wants is what's his. I'm not saying villains can't have more than one motivation. I'm saying the movie seems to be constantly reminding itself what Electro's whole deal was in the first place, while it's trying to dupe us into thinking he's somehow tragic and compelling, when all it really needs is someone that hates Spider-Man. Except it doesn't need that at all. Take Electro out, and you've got plenty of room to really flesh out Harry and make his turn to the dark side natural. It wouldn't feel so conveniently timed that all this stuff is happening all at once, totally unrelated to each other, if you didn't have a random electric eel accident at the same time as you have Harry's dad dying and is realizing he has the disease. Trying to juggle all that becomes disastrous. Sometimes Peter is ping-ponged between so many subplots, he'll be motivated by one to do something related to another one, and it doesn't really follow. Any more than that speech Electro has about a world without power, a world without Spider-Man. When Peter gets his web shooter busted in the first fight with Electro, he gets bummed out, and that's played as the impetus for his starting to look into his father again, when he's been avoiding it all movie, visually demonstrated by his stuffing his dad's bag in a closet. What is it about broken web shooters that motivate him to get back to the Oscorp wall of weird? You could certainly make a good Spider-Man movie about fame and fortune and how it makes people detached versus the exact opposite having a similar effect. That's the one thing Electro and Harry have in common. Not that they both used to have the same friend. Their extreme social situations have caused them both to lose perspective. You could explore Peter's newfound notoriety as Spider-Man and how what grounds him is that he hasn't left the streets. Although I guess Marvel has now kind of made that movie, and with another everyman villain that doesn't have to be a complete nutjob from the word go. That is the real problem with both of our bad guys here. You can chalk up anything they do before or after they get powers to, that guy's crazy. And unless we witness or at least understand how or why they got that way, they're just glorified plot devices instead of human beings, and they become boring to watch. I mean, Electro is just Andrew from Chronicle without the tragic past and the believable mental and emotional deterioration that makes his time bomb go off. And of course, this happens to Andrew when he's a teenager and he's emotionally vulnerable and is at that age where he's still trying to find himself. And I can't believe we have that in a movie with the guy who played Andrew from Chronicle giving a similar performance. Lastly, the way Electro gets his name is hilarious, and I have to point it out before I close. It's something I never would have noticed without subtitles. Max seems to simply come up with the name out of the blue, which is fine. It describes what he is, and the movie doesn't come up with some ostensibly clever and cute reason for it, which I really appreciate. But when he attacks Times Square, someone in the audience screams, and I'm sure it's an extra ad-libbing and having no idea what the sequence of events is in the script, Electro Dummy. So yeah, unless he didn't hear that and they came up with the name independently, Max heard the lamest insult anyone's ever uttered and derived his supervillain name from that. I gotta say, this is a more fun movie to watch than it is to think about. There's plenty here to poke fun of, and I enjoyed that, but some of the ideas and character stuff worked better in my head than they started to as I wrote about them. The more I've talked about it here, the more I'm beginning to appreciate people's hatred for it, and that's certainly not what I hoped would happen as I tackled it. I still love the things I love, but it's definitely messy and clearly an 11th hour edit that needed a few more hours. At graduation, we learned that Uncle Ben used to quote Emerson, saying, "Don't just follow the path, make your own trail." I wish the studio had been confident enough to allow Marc Webb to do that with this film, rather than trying to appease everyone. I'm giving The Amazing Spider-Man 2 a 2 out of 4.